All right, everyone, I want to thank our sponsor today, Organifi. You know, we talk a lot on this podcast about healing and the healing journey. Well, an integral part of that are the foods and the drinks that we consume. I know you know this. If you're like me, you know the importance of eating healthy, but you don't always have the time or the willpower to cook with all the colors of the rainbow. Organifi's superfood blends make it easy and enjoyable to add more variety and nutrition to your day. These are delicious organic powders that you can add to water or milk, stir and drink. It literally takes 30 seconds. It is that simple. A couple weeks ago, I was right about to start a green juice fast, a kind of a short mini fast. And I kid you not, the night before, Organifi reached out to me about sponsoring this podcast. And I will tell you that I was thrilled because this is aligned with what I'm doing. I'm familiar with Organifi. I've used them in the past before. I want to be able to bring to you quality products and things that are going to promote a healthy lifestyle. Organifi green juice is the one I use. It's the one I use every morning so that I know right away I'm starting the day on a healthy note. It's loaded with vitamins, loaded with minerals, and essential antioxidants. As a listener of the Trauma Therapist Podcast, you can get 21% off any item by going to Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Once again, to get 21% off any item, go to Organifi, that's Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. All right, everyone, I want to thank our sponsor today, Organifi. You know, we talk a lot on this podcast about healing and the healing journey. Well, an integral part of that are the foods and the drinks that we consume. I know you know this. If you're like me, you know the importance of eating healthy, but you don't always have the time or the willpower to cook with all the colors of the rainbow. Organifi's superfood blends make it easy and enjoyable to add more variety and nutrition to your day. These are delicious organic powders that you can add to water or milk, stir and drink. It literally takes 30 seconds. It is that simple. A couple weeks ago, I was right about to start a green juice fast, a kind of a short mini fast. And I kid you not, the night before, Organifi reached out to me about sponsoring this podcast. And I will tell you that I was thrilled because this is aligned with what I'm doing. I'm familiar with Organifi. I've used them in the past before. I want to be able to bring to you quality products and things that are going to promote a healthy lifestyle. Organifi green juice is the one I use. It's the one I use every morning so that I know right away I'm starting the day on a healthy note. It's loaded with vitamins, loaded with minerals, and essential antioxidants. As a listener of the Trauma Therapist Podcast, you can get 21% off any item by going to Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Once again, to get 21% off any item, go to Organifi, that's Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 348. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to help support and inspire new trauma workers through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. Thanks so much for joining me today, and here we go. All right, everyone, I want to thank our sponsor today, Organifi. You know, we talk a lot on this podcast about healing and the healing journey. Well, an integral part of that are the foods and the drinks that we consume. I know you know this. If you're like me, you know the importance of eating healthy, but you don't always have the time or the willpower to cook with all the colors of the rainbow. Organifi's superfood blends make it easy and enjoyable to add more variety and nutrition to your day. These are delicious organic powders that you can add to water or milk, stir and drink. It literally takes 30 seconds. It is that simple. A couple weeks ago, I was right about to start a green juice fast, a kind of a short mini fast. And I kid you not, the night before, Organifi reached out to me about sponsoring this podcast. And I will tell you that I was thrilled because this is aligned with what I'm doing. I'm familiar with Organifi. I've used them in the past before. I want to be able to bring to you quality products and things that are going to promote a healthy lifestyle. Organifi Green Juice is the one I use. It's the one I use every morning so that I know right away I'm starting the day on a healthy note. It's loaded with vitamins, loaded with minerals, and essential antioxidants. As a listener of the Trauma Therapist Podcast, you can get 21% off any item by going to Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Once again, to get 21% off any item, go to Organifi, that's Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. Super excited to be talking today to Esther Goldstein. Esther, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
All right. So Esther Goldstein, LCSW, is a psychotherapist and trauma specialist with a private practice in Cedarhurst, Long Island. Esther specializes in treating anxiety, trauma, complex PTSD, and dissociative disorders. She provides trauma-informed consultation to therapists committed to improving their trauma-informed practice and attachment-focused EMDR consultation to therapists attaining hours towards their EMDRIA certification. Esther, awesome. I'm so excited. Someone from the East Coast is here.
Yes.
share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you're calling from, and let's do it.
Okay, cool. Awesome. I'm so happy to be here. So actually, I live out in the 5 towns of Long Island in New York. And I actually grew up. I mean, should I talk a little bit about my younger years or where I'm at right now?
Where are you from originally? That'll be good enough for this.
I grew up in a suburb. Yeah, I grew up in the suburbs in Rockland County. But my practice now in the past couple of years have been here in Long Island, New York.
Cool. All right, so let's start out as we do with a quote, a saying, a sentence, a mantra, something to kind of set the tone. What do you have for us?
Okay, so I have this quote that I love, and it's called, "Hardships often prepared ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny," by C.S. Lewis.
Nice, okay. Say that again, and then let's take a dive into it.
Okay, so hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny.
Okay, so why that quote?
Okay, so, many times people will say, like, what do you actually mean, right? Like, what does it mean to actually have an extraordinary destiny? Now, here's the way that I see trauma. Trauma is something, there's so many different kinds of traumatic experiences that kind of shatter a person. It's like their whole worldview gets shattered. And sometimes what we see is that, or I've been humbled to see that, in the shattering, in the breaking, there's actually over time in the healing process, a birthing of something that's really unique. And I've seen people, build the extraordinary. Now, that doesn't have to mean, becoming the next Nobel Peace Prize winner. It could be, embodying a self, creating and accessing a whole new world. So that's what I think extraordinary means here.
Yeah, I love that. And oftentimes, I mean, as our listeners know, that can be very difficult to see, right? When you're walking into an office for the first time, realizing something's wrong, and it can be inconceivable that, something extraordinary or even kind of above baseline can come out of this. But let's move on here. How did you get into this work, this specialization? Tell us that story.
Okay, so actually, I was always a truth seeker. I grew up in a pretty sheltered community, but I remember always being curious about understanding how the human mind works. And there were a few different people who were in leadership roles who I noticed were struggling with some kind of addiction. And I was very curious about what that was about. They had on the outside things were together or had like a sense of meaning and direction. And I dove deeper as my developing years and, training as being a therapist to understanding what is it that really makes somebody actually get stuck in, mental health patterns that, yeah. So I just went on to understanding the human mind, because there were people who externally I thought, wow, they have it together. They have the family and the finance and, the professional and the spiritual. And what I came to look at was, sometimes trauma doesn't have an address or a specific external, a picture, but, people could have trauma and you would never know. And it was that was beneath a lot of their struggles.
So when did you see or notice or observe these people? How old were you at this point?
I was younger. I would probably say I was about like 10, 11, 12. There was one person. I was young. It was more of like there was one person specifically who I have much respect for, but was a close family friend and, shared his journey very openly, actually, in his road to recovery. And it just really made me think, like, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought that someone like that is struggling, but wow. Obviously, my thoughts evolved as I matured and I got to, to be more curious about what that looks like. So
why do you think that specific aspect of the human condition kind of piqued your interest? Why did that pull you?
So actually, I mean, I could talk more about this now or later, but I actually started off with getting curious about addictions, because addiction was just like, it's kind of a mental health, struggle, a disease that really wreaks havoc. It overtakes the person's mind, body, and spirit. And I was just wondering, like, what is this powerful, potent, disease that really takes someone over? And I mean, I actually started off my specialization and my training in addiction. It later turned into trauma, and I could explain what that was about. But I really just wanted to understand the power beyond this, like what was really beneath it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting to hear you say, you were such a young kid, and there was something about that kind of pulled you, that sparked your interest. And I'm not sure if I've gotten there yet about what that was. I mean, I know you were interested in it, but let's kind of unfold this and unpack this more and talk about how things evolved for you. Okay, so you're 10, but you graduated from high school. Was this a path you said, this is it for me, or what?
I think just in terms of that specific person, I think that what really struck me was that somebody who's in a leadership role, somebody who had a lot of community respect, was really struggling with something, because it's a human condition. And I think that it really just was like, wow, like if somebody has a struggle, it's not about, and the humility and the power and the strength that person had to then seek help. So what was the question of my next steps, you're saying? Yeah.
How did things unfold for you?
So I actually started out, and I did a specialization from my social work program in treating those struggling with addictions. And while I found the work really powerful and meaningful, I saw that, we're trying to shift a behavior, we're trying to change something, but essentially if we're not healing the core and the root of the pain and the suffering, you're going to close one door, but then another door is going to open with wherever the pain is coming from. So there's actually a quote by Yalom that says, the pain is there. When you close one door on it, it knocks to come in somewhere else. So I just was very intrigued to let's just see the core for many people of when they began to learn how to self-soothe or turn to some form of addiction was actually trauma. So
it's almost always hiding somewhere.
Yeah.
Sometimes not hiding. So you talked a little bit about, what piqued your interest. Why do you think or what do you think within you, Esther, allows you to do this work? And I would even go so far as to say, what makes you good at it?
Right. Okay. Good question. Well, maybe I should mention just an important story. I was actually living abroad at some point in time, and I was actually doing an internship working with people struggling with addictions, and I ended up contributing and doing some counseling work for people who are in terror attacks. And so what kind of sparked my curiosity for trauma, and was the fact that I looked at, the difference between the shock trauma that people went through, survivors of terror attacks, versus the developmental trauma, so to speak, or the ongoing trauma or other kinds of trauma that some of the clients I was treating, and then just looking at the brain scans and then their prognosis for recovery. So I really, I was going to do my PhD at Hebrew University, and I basically was like, nope. I ended up, getting accepted for post-grad training in complex post-traumatic stress disorder at Hebrew U, and I went there. And so the birthing of my passion was really understanding the brain, the mind, the body, really looking at, people think of trauma as like a car accident, but actually there's so many silent wounds. And so really just getting committed to, like, when I offer healing just as a psychotherapist, I was looking at, like, how am I really getting to the core? How am I really getting to treat, like, the mind, the body, the spirit, the soul? And a lot of that had to do with really looking at, how the person was impacted not only by, the external trauma or by addiction, but also the people who were suffering in silence from, like, emotional neglect, abandonment, and things like that.
So talk a little bit, if you will, about the differences in maybe what you saw. You said, the difference between like a shock trauma or a terrorist attack or maybe developmental trauma. What can people know or hear about that? I think that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. So, I guess the word trauma usually, sends like a shiver down people's spine, and they think like, ooh, something bad, something big, something terrible, not me. And so shock trauma, usually does refer to a single incident, event, an assault, an attack, an accident that kind of shakes the system. But somebody could go through a shock trauma, and, if they had a pretty steady upbringing, childhood, and they have pretty, robust supports and resources, the healing prognosis for that might look simpler. So I don't like making promises across the board, but it's going to look like, on an infrastructure that's pretty steady, something that was shocking, shook up, the sense of safety. But, you go in and you do the healing work. And so it's going to look different than someone who developmental trauma, I call it like the silent wounds. It's usually, sometimes, it also is like assaults and attacks, but sometimes as well, developmental refers to like the developing years and just having experiences of sometimes absence, right? Like this trauma of omission, of where things were not there that you needed, and this trauma of commission, of things that, that happen, like hitting, attacks, and things like that. So it's more of like, weaved into the years of development. Sometimes somebody has either like a parent who's an alcoholic, maybe just a stressor in the family or the community. So they didn't get the attention that they needed. They were bullied on an ongoing basis, shamed. Sometimes it's like very subtle, but it's just not getting, the nurturing and the attentiveness and the responsiveness that the person needed. But just so, and in that, it's just sometimes it's the impact is on the personality development, the identity. Today's term might call it self-esteem, self-confidence, but it's really the core beliefs of self that really, that really, sometimes get kicked up when there's, experiences in their later life. Sometimes they'll notice they have a hard time in adulthood. So what I saw, just to go back to, terror attacks, what I saw was that the people who were traumatized by an attack, the ones who had, pretty steady or steady enough, so to speak, because none of us have perfect childhoods, but, backgrounds healed quicker than the ones who had some kind of developmental trauma. But not to sound too like happy and joyous, at the same time, some of them who really committed to the healing said, something about like having to do the healing work really helped them heal other wounds that they weren't aware were there, like ongoing anxiety. They didn't know why it was there. But, focusing on healing from a shock trauma sometimes opened up also healing developmental trauma if it was there.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's talk about like an early clinical error. This particular question, is a really good one. It maybe does put people on the spot, but let's face it, everyone has, errors, mistakes, whatever you want to call them.
Totally, yeah.
But it's for new clinicians and even, somewhat seasoned clinicians to hear how you what you learned from that is very powerful.
Totally. Yeah. Okay. Totally. I would be happy to. Okay. So I actually was working at a treatment center, and there was an incident that happened that was, that shook the whole the whole community. And I actually at that point was like young. I would say the error, just to frame it, is doubt, like that I doubted myself. Mm-hmm. And I reached out to. When
you say doubted yourself, what, your abilities, who you, what? Say more about that.
My clinical opinion, and I'll just go on more and you'll understand it. So basically, I reached out to, and I was with a bunch of adolescents and young adults, and they were turning to me, to try to make sense of what just happened. There was a loss. There was something that really shook everybody up in a pretty traumatic kind of way. And I basically reached out to a supervisor at that point who encouraged me to distract everybody and try to help them not focus on what was happening. And maybe in some cases that would have been correct, but my gut feeling in that point was like they really need a place to talk. Actually, they need an adult that could model to them how to hold confusion, pain, sadness, and really just allow them to speak, to process in whatever way they needed. And I remember just feeling that like pull of like, no, Esther, you know what they need, like listen in. And I listened to my supervisor actually. And I remember afterwards I was there for some of the repair, but a lot of the, the people at the program said, it was horrible because we really needed somebody to listen to us and hold us. And I think, and I got an opportunity to repair, but I think that what I really learned is like trust your clinical intuition and, assess the situation. I really offer that like clinically. Yeah.
That's such a good one. Thank you so much. Yeah. That trust. How did you cultivate that trust?
Good question. I think that, some things we can't just like buy in a shop. It's more of like the birthing process of different parts of ourselves. And I would say, first of all, mistakes as you speak, right? Like, learning from trusting that, in my humanity, like there's going to be times that I make mistakes, but the best thing that I can do is really own them and take accountability and humbly learn from them so that I, could be a better clinician and human being in the next opportunity. I think also clinical trainings, I think trainings, getting to practice as a therapist, a lot of the latest training modalities also make the therapist, receive some of the training, practice them. I'm trained in a couple of the sensory motor, EMDR, parts work. And also I think that getting consultation and also your own healing therapy. I think that you can't separate the therapist from the person that we are. Mm-hmm. And I think just committing to just improving myself as a clinician, and also it improves me as a human being of having more integrity, more humility, much more compassion and patience, I would say.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. So how do you bring in yourself to the sessions? And a lot of times, I know for myself, when I was seeing clients, and I've often talked about this before, I didn't do that at all. I mean, I thought that, the answer was for me to just like absorb every training I could, read everything I could, and basically, have page 232 of, Pat Ogden's book, memorized for that right time. And of course, it's ridiculous, but, there's so much about what you're saying, I think is so inspiring, this being yourself. Talk about that process. How did you get there? How did you realize that, okay, this is me, I've got to bring it in to a certain degree?
Okay, so I'm like laughing right here. My eyes are like sparkling up. I'll tell you why. I was the first person. I probably was also, as you say, like, there's a lot, thank God, on the one hand that there's so much knowledge about trauma treatment and the right way to do it and the not right way to do it and, not to re-traumatize your clients. And I was that person who reached out to like every expert in the field and was getting consultation from so many people. And at one point, my brain was just like, oh my goodness, stop. And at that point, I was like, I've disowned my own self. We talk about in therapy, like, becoming embodied, finding your voice, really accessing your own backbone and not one that's your neighbors or your friends or even your therapist. And at a certain point, I was like, Esther, like, where's your wisdom? Like, yes, lean into the consultation, but, like, find one or two people that can really guide you, lean into a book, but really just allow the magic, allow the beauty of, what the client in front of you has to offer, their story and the healing that you can provide together, and just lean into that. And I've actually found that my sessions have been incredibly more potent and impactful, and yeah, it's been transformative.
Gold right there, Esther. I love it. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Esther Goldstein, and your website is integrativepsych.co. I'll have it linked up here at the show notes page at thetraumatherapistpodcast.com. I love your website, by the way.
Thank you.
All right. So, what, in terms of, you do consultation and stuff, what are you seeing in terms of, newer therapists and they're becoming trauma informed? How is this happening out there? What are you seeing on the streets with boots on the ground in terms of, newer clinicians? Are they becoming trauma informed? Is there fear there, hesitancy there? What?
Good question. Okay, so I think that becoming a trauma therapist, and I'll use your word for a minute, but I think it does require a certain sense of boldness. I think it requires a certain sense of, I would say, emotional grit. I think it also requires a tremendous amount of patience, of trust, and of, humility, because as much as we might become experts, and there's people who want to become really good in the field, there's so much to learn. I mean, what I see is a lot of young budding clinicians who really want, or maybe have worked in different specializations. A lot of them, they themselves have had experiences receiving, treatment and want to give back. And they're just really passionate about finding good treatment methods and also becoming a good therapist, so that they become the stop, or one of the stops that could be helpful to clients. Because so many times, people say, like, I don't want to be one of those therapists that, clients go from person to person, but right. Sometimes they need that trauma-informed therapist to really help validate and start doing the process of healing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Emotional grit and patience and stuff. Did you have all that when you stepped into this field? Some people do, right? Some people are just like, gritty. I mean, I have to say for myself, I think, well, no, I don't think I did have emotional grit. That had to be cultivated, certainly. I think I had certain things I had more of, but what about for you?
I always joke. I used to say, like, at 18-year-old, I had the whole world figured out. Like, I knew the best way to parent. I wasn't a mom yet. I knew the best way, to, like, explain psychology, explain concepts. And then, like, as the years went on, I was just like, wow, like, I have so much more to learn. And actually, I think that living life and experiencing, really diving into experiences and seeing what the world has to offer, what your own, journey has to offer you. That's why that quote that I mentioned earlier, although it sounds fluffy and happy, what I mean about, making an ordinary person extraordinary, what I mean is sometimes it's like, the process of, yes, I think all of us have resilience, right? Some of us have to, strengthen that muscle and really, practice strategies and skills to continue that. But, I think there's something about leaning into your ordinariness, so to speak, and finding your own extraordinary, right? So if you have some kind of emotional pull to becoming a therapist, that's amazing. You don't have to have a tremendous amount of emotional grit. I think it's about cultivating, like, your strength. What is your strength? What does it look like? How are you navigating this world? And how to kind of, continue developing that and expanding that for yourself as you move through.
Awesome. I bet you're an amazing supervisor and consultation person.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Really? That's awesome. All right. How about a go-to book recommendation?
Okay. So what I love is Janina Fisher has a book called Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors. And what I love about it is it really depathologizes trauma, explains the neurobiology of trauma. She talks about, becoming embodied and not disowning the parts of self. She doesn't use, what I love about it, she doesn't use, like, the diagnoses, some of the popular diagnoses where people kind of are almost shamed. She really just normalizes the brain and the body, and great tips for clinicians if they really want to get good at understanding trauma treatment.
Awesome. One of my favorite people, Janina Fisher, Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors. Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So let's talk a little bit more about what you do. Share with our listeners, obviously we talked about it in the introduction, but what do you do? Break it down for us in terms of the therapy and or services you provide.
Okay. So, I split my time between, providing psychotherapy services and consultation for trauma therapists. But I would say in terms of psychotherapy, I always ask clients from the beginning, when they reach out, if therapy were to work well, how would we know? Like in 6 months time, a year time, obviously some clients have shorter term treatment, some have incredibly longer term treatment depending on their needs, but how would we know? And I start with the end in mind because I think it's important for us to begin the conversation of listening in to what are the body symptoms, what are the thoughts, what are the ways that you're showing up as a person in relationships, to work, and to possibilities. And so, to give a little bit of how I work, I really, it's kind of like a blank slate when I meet a new client, but I really look to find the resources and the strengths and the resilience, because if somebody, depending on their trauma, if there's no size, big or small, there's something that helped them get through. And we also look at the wounding and how we could offer healing to that. I use a lot of creative methods. I think that, one of the things in trauma is that the creativity, the right part of the brain gets dried up. And so, clients sometimes come in and they're like, do you work with kids? And I always joke back, I work with the inner parts, the inner children that we have. And we really use a lot of, somatic informed work, but I have different parts cards. We sometimes will do things with pastels, paints, really finding other creative methods, because sometimes the words are just not enough or there's no words. Right. So really just taking clients through that healing process. And sometimes, they explore things they never knew were there, but I think my overview is really, helping the person heal, but while keeping it contained and, so that they could go out and function in their day-to-day life and, start feeling stronger even as they're healing, which could be tough many times.
Awesome. And what's the best way for people to get in contact with you, Esther?
I would say my website is integrativepsych.co. And then there's also my email and phone, but honestly, I'm most responsive to email because it's on paper, and then I read emails and write back.
Awesome. All right, Esther, man, inspiring talking to you. I loved it. I want to thank you so much. Yeah.
I'm so happy to have been on here. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, we'll be in touch.
Yeah, take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye. CPTSDfoundation.org provides daily recovery support, live group calls, 365 days a year. All calls are led by trauma-informed advocates, authors, and highly respected practitioners in the field of trauma recovery. CPTSDfoundation.org helps survivors connect with others who've walked through the fire of abuse and are on a path toward healing. After working with thousands of survivors all around the world, they know how to help you escape the shame of abuse by connecting with like-minded individuals so you can finally feel like healing is possible. Stop isolating between therapy appointments. Getting re-traumatized with your current strategy is no longer necessary. Reach out to CPTSD Foundation today and discover the life-changing, daily, trauma-informed peer support you've been waiting for. That's CPTSDfoundation.org. You know how deeply trauma impacts your client's mind, body, and emotions, and how difficult healing can be. You have clients who are constantly and unpredictably triggered by their traumatic experiences, controlled by emotions of shame, anxiety, anger, depression, and fear, and even turning to substance abuse, cutting, and other harmful behaviors to cope. World-renowned expert and author Dr. Janina Fisher's proven approach to complex trauma treatment, which is based on 40-plus years of research and clinical practice, addresses the holistic impact of trauma to effectively heal deep trauma and attachment wounds so clients can break free from the past, feel safe, calm, and thrive in life. If you're ready to become a certified complex trauma treatment professional and master neurobiologically informed treatments that will heal trauma, save marriages and families, and help clients take back their lives, then join my friends over at Pessy and save $500 today by signing up at www.pessy.com/trauma treatment. That's www.pessy, spelled PESI.com/trauma treatment.